Now, I wanted to tell you, before we go on to the next segment here, remember I told you that I retired from the Vitamin World store in Primm? Well, I want you to know, 6 months after I retired, the store went out of business. It closed. Although I was number one for almost all of the year, which means the store was number one for all of the year, after I left and people found out I was no longer there, the store went out of business. Okay? And that was because I had knowledge that nobody else had. Now, as I said, I became a bartender, and I'm going to show you my verification now that I was a bartender. And until I retired, I had one thrilling time as a bartender. Every event that there was in Vegas, I worked. A lot of stuff that I wouldn't have went to or wouldn't have paid money to go see, I got to see. Who would have thought that Elton John and Billy Joel with their dueling pianos was one of the best concerts I've ever heard. And although I seen the Kings of Comedy, and I was there for the Kings of Comedy at the MGM, I worked that show and I met them, but who would have not thought that Robin Williams would have had people rolling in the aisles like you wouldn't believe, one of the funniest comics I've ever seen. I said, now don't get me wrong, the Kings of Comedies was good as well as a bunch of other ones that I seen. And when Sade first came to town, they had never heard of her before. You heard Sade, Smooth Operator. They had never heard of her before, so they just had one little show scheduled for her. And so the tickets sold out within the first day. They had to put on another show so that enough people could get in to see her with Sade. And Barbra Streisand, Barbra Streisand, when she was working there, she didn't allow nobody to look at her. And if you passed her in the halls and stuff, you had to look away. I got a chance to walk up and see Tina Turner's $1 Million Legs. I walked right up close and looked close. And it was bad. I seen Cher. Cher can sing. That girl can sing, you hear me? She can really, really sing. But anyway, that's just to let you know, every concert there was in Las Vegas, and everybody comes to Las Vegas, I worked it. And because of my business sense and my education, I was able to have my bar in the arenas. So I was able to see most of the shows. And then a lot of the big shows, like when I was working at the Orleans Arena, I worked up at VIP. See, Orleans had a semi-pro hockey team there. So people would buy the tickets for the whole year. So when a lot of the big black concerts came to town, they didn't want to see that, so they would give me the tickets because they bought tickets for everything for the year. So they would give me the tickets, and I'd give my tickets to ask your mama. He did. I'd give the tickets to my grandkids and my children and everybody, and we would have a ball, we would have a very good time because we'd almost have the whole arena to ourselves at VIP. And especially when Art Laboe came with his Valentine's show, we had a fabulous time. But anyway, I'm going to go now, like I told you, I'm going to go over to They Came Before Columbus. I'm going to introduce you to the man who wrote it first, and then I'm going to let you hear some of what he wrote, They Came Before Columbus. And then I'm going to finish it up with the great Dr. Ben. And I'm not talking about no Ben Carson. When I say Dr. Ben, I'm talking about Jocano, and we call him Dr. Ben. Okay, so without further ado, introduce you now to Ivan Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima, as he's going to tell you here, he went to a big committee where he went to prove that Columbus didn't discover America, that the African presence was in America long before Columbus got there. And they asked him if he was crazy. And I'm going to let him tell you how he answered that.
They came before Columbus. The African Presence in Ancient America by Ivan Van Sertima. Copyright 1976. About the author. Ivan Van Sertima's pioneering work in linguistics and anthropology has appeared in numerous anthologies and journals. He is a regular contributor to the Inter-American Review, has published a collection of poems, critical essays, and a Swahili dictionary of legal terms, and has written on the subject of the African presence in pre-Columbian America for the New York Times. Professor Van Sertima teaches at Rutgers University. Ivan Van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus. The African Presence in Ancient America. Introduction. 6 years ago, during my first brief visit to America, I came across 3 volumes in the private library of a Princeton professor. They had been published half a century ago, and their title fascinated me. Africa and the Discovery of America. They represented a lifetime of dedicated scholarship by a Harvard linguist, Leo Wiener. Professor Wiener had been working on a grammar of American languages in the early years of this century when he stumbled upon a body of linguistic phenomena that indicated clearly to him the presence of an African and Arabic influence on some medieval Mexican and South American languages before the European contact period. As I say, I was fascinated by the subject. The thesis was revolutionary, the evidence novel and startling. The implications of such a thesis, if proven, could have far-reaching consequences for both American and African history. But I returned to my home in London after reading these books only partially convinced. I was intrigued and impressed, but very skeptical. I felt like a man who had come upon a dozen clues to a sensational murder, but did not feel too confident about the evidence. The smell of blood, even the marks of the bullet were there, but far more important things, the body and the gun, were missing. Later that year, I returned to live and teach in the United States. I returned also to that obscure trilogy of Wiener. I began to see far more than I had at first. I began to understand what was the source of my doubts. Professor Wiener was writing too early, when too many bits of the puzzle were missing. Furthermore, while he was a trained linguist and his reading was wide, his method of dealing with anthropological data was naive. He depended too heavily on the fragile pillars of philology to support the great weight of his thesis. Yet, in spite of these inadequacies, something of lasting value emerged. It sank to the bottom of my mind and began to radiate quiet, flashing signals that haunted me. In the fall of 1970, at the request of a magazine editor, I sat down to simplify and summarize Wiener. I also began to examine some of his primary sources. I felt the case was an unproven case, but by no means a closed case. I was in no position then to explore it to its limits, but I felt that information should not remain buried under 50 years of silence. It should be circulated afresh. Then something happened that started me off on a hunt that has been like the leads in a detective story, from suspect to suspect, print to print, clue to clue, until finally I came upon what lawyers like to call the smoking gun. On the very day I submitted my summary of the Wiener case to a magazine, the novelist John Williams submitted to the same an interview with a lecturer in art at the University of the Americas in Mexico City, Professor Alexander von Wuthenau. Professor von Wuthenau had done extensive searches of private collections and museums in the Americas, and also his own excavation